All right, so welcome to the deep dive, and today we're going to be diving into Noam Chomsky's American Power and the New Mandarins.
Oh, yeah.
We've got an excerpt from the intro in the chapter, The Bitter Heritage, to really kind of dig into.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing on how intellectuals, particularly those shaping American foreign policy, might end up justifying some pretty questionable actions.
It's like they almost become these gatekeepers, of acceptable thought. And Chomsky calls them new Mandarins.
Right.
And he's worried they prioritize practicality and stability over actual truth and justice.
Yeah, and I think we see that, in the news all the time.
Yeah.
You see these experts coming on and justifying policies that seem kind of messed up.
You're right.
And Chomsky would say, look deeper.
Yeah.
Who benefits from these policies?
Right.
Are they really about spreading democracy, or
is
there something else going on?
Exactly. And one of the big examples that Chomsky uses is the Vietnam War. He's particularly critical of how intellectuals at the time, people like Arthur Schlesinger, framed the escalation as this rational strategy to force the Viet Cong to the negotiating table.
But didn't the Viet Cong want to negotiate anyway?
Exactly.
I mean, wasn't that part of the issue, was that they were being ignored?
That's exactly Chomsky's point.
Okay.
He's saying Schlesinger and others, they cherry-picked facts to fit this narrative of American rationality.
Okay.
Completely overlooking the historical context and the Viet Cong's consistent calls for negotiations.
So it's like using fancy language and logic to obscure the real motives, which might be less about peace.
Yeah.
And more about, as Chomsky argues, maintaining American dominance in the region.
Right, and that kind of brings us to Chomsky's bigger warning about the dangers of blindly accepting expert opinions, especially those close to power.
Yeah.
He uses some pretty intense examples, like Professor David N. Rowe suggesting that the U.S. buy up surplus wheat.
Wow. To intentionally cause mass starvation in China.
Oh, wow, that's dark. But I guess it illustrates his point that expertise doesn't automatically equal morality.
Right.
You can be brilliant and still use your knowledge for some pretty messed up things.
Exactly. Chomsky's saying you can't just take their word for it because they have a PhD or a government position.
Yeah.
Yeah. We need to be critical thinkers, question their assumptions, look for evidence to support their claims.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it feels like we're constantly bombarded with all of these expert opinions these days, especially when it comes to foreign policy.
Right.
How do we even begin to sift through it all and figure out, what to believe?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Chomsky would say that one of the most important things is to be aware of the potential for bias, especially when experts have a vested interest in a particular outcome.
So, if they're working for the government.
Right.
Or a think tank.
Exactly.
That's funded by
certain industries or something like that.
Exactly. Chomsky's not saying that all experts are corrupt or intentionally misleading.
Right.
But he is urging us to be cautious and to really consider who's benefiting from the information that they're presenting.
So it's not just about the facts themselves,
all right,
but also the context in which they're being presented. Who's saying it, why they might be saying it, who stands to gain from it.
Exactly. And this is where Chomsky's idea of the responsibility of intellectuals comes in.
Right.
He believes that, those who have access to knowledge and platforms have a moral obligation to use them for good, to challenge the status quo, and to speak truth to power.
But that can be really risky, though, right?
Oh,
especially if it means going against the grain or challenging, those in positions of authority. I mean, look at what happened to whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning.
Absolutely. Chomsky acknowledges that speaking out can have very serious consequences.
Yeah.
But he argues that it's still a necessary act of courage.
Yes.
Yeah.
He uses this analogy of the good German during the Nazi era, those who knew about the atrocities but chose to remain silent.
Yeah, it's like that famous quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Chomsky's saying we can't just sit back and hope that someone else will, fight for what's right.
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to speak up, even if it's just in our own small circles.
But what about those times when it feels like our voices don't really matter? Like when you're up against these massive institutions and powerful interests.
Well, Chomsky actually points to historical examples like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement,
Okay.
where ordinary people through collective action and persistence,
Right.
we're able to create significant change.
So it's about finding ways to amplify our voices, to join together with others who share our concerns.
Yeah.
And to keep pushing for change even when it seems impossible.
Right. Chomsky's not suggesting that it's easy.
Yeah.
But he is saying that it's necessary.
He argues that apathy and complacency are some of the greatest threats to a just and equitable society.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
Right.
How do we stay informed and engaged and active, especially when it feels like we're constantly bombarded with information and all these conflicting opinions?
Well, Chomsky stresses the importance of critical thinking, developing the skills to analyze information, to identify bias, to form our own conclusions.
Yeah.
He's not advocating for blind skepticism, but for a healthy dose of questioning and independent thought.
So it's not about rejecting everything we hear.
Right.
But approaching information with a critical lens, asking questions, seeking out diverse perspectives.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to challenge our own assumptions, to acknowledge our own biases, and to be open to changing our minds when presented with new evidence.
That could be tough, though, right?
It can.
I mean, it's much easier to kind of just go with the flow and accept what we're told, especially when it's coming from sources that we perceive as authoritative or, experts in their field.
That's true. But Chomsky argues that complacency is a very dangerous trap, that it allows those in power to maintain control and to perpetuate injustices.
Right.
He's calling on us to be active participants in shaping our world, not passive consumers of information.
So it's about recognizing our own agency, our ability to think for ourselves, to make informed choices, and to act in ways that align with our values.
Right, and it's about recognizing that even small acts of resistance taken collectively can have a really powerful impact.
Yeah.
Whether it's speaking out against injustice, supporting organizations that are working for positive change, or simply educating ourselves and others about important issues.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. Chomsky's reminding us that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world, and that it all starts with our own actions and choices.
But it's also about understanding the systems and structures that perpetuate these injustices, right?
Yeah.
Like Chomsky's critique of American foreign policy and how it often prioritizes stability over human rights.
Absolutely. Chomsky's not just calling for individual action, he's also calling for systemic change.
Okay.
He argues that we need to challenge the underlying assumptions and ideologies that drive these harmful policies.
Right.
And to work towards creating more just and equitable systems.
And that's where the role of intellectuals comes in again, right? To use their knowledge and platforms to analyze these systems, to expose their flaws, and to advocate for alternatives.
Precisely. Chomsky sees intellectuals as having this very crucial role in this process of social transformation.
Oh, okay.
Not just as critics of the status quo, but as visionaries who can help us imagine and create a better future.
So it's a two-pronged approach.
Right.
Individual action and systemic change.
Yeah.
We need both to really make a difference.
Right. And it's a constant process, a continuous struggle for justice and equity. Chomsky's work reminds us that there's always more to be done, more to learn, more to fight for.
Yeah, it really feels like we're living in a time when those systems are being challenged more and more.
Yeah.
You see people speaking out against injustice.
Yeah.
They're demanding accountability, and they're pushing for real change.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Chomsky's work so relevant today. He gives us this framework for understanding how power operates, how it's often masked by, language and ideology, and ultimately how we can resist it.
But it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all, though, right? Like one person can't possibly make a difference against these huge, complex problems.
I think Chomsky would say it's precisely when we feel overwhelmed that it's most important to remember our own agency.
Okay.
To focus on what we can control, our own actions, our own choices, our own spheres of influence.
So instead of getting paralyzed by the enormity of it all,
right,
we can kind of just step back and be like, okay, well, what can I do right here, right now to make a positive impact?
Exactly. It might be something as simple as, having a conversation with a friend or family member about these issues, or donating to an organization that's working for change, or simply educating yourself further on a particular topic.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It's a process, it's a journey, and every step we take, no matter how small, contributes to that larger movement.
And Chomsky reminds us that it's not about achieving some perfect utopia.
Right.
It's about constantly striving for a more just and equitable world knowing that there will always be challenges and setbacks along the way.
He has this one great quote that I think really sums it up. He says, "Nothing is easier than to adopt a new form of self-indulgence, no less debilitating than the old apathy."
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
A challenge to break free from complacency and to really embrace the responsibility we all have to make the world a better place.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Chomsky's American Power and the New Mandarins, I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't just sit back and passively accept the world as it is. We have a responsibility to be informed and engaged citizens who question, who challenge, and ultimately who act.
And to remember that our voices matter, that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, our collective actions can create a ripple effect that leads to meaningful change.
Well, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this has sparked some critical thinking and maybe even inspired a little bit of action out there.